Welcome to the Nurturing Fathers Podcast, a show dedicated to helping men succeed at the most challenging and rewarding job they'll ever have, being a dad. Your hosts are Mark Perlman, the creator and founder of the Nurturing Fathers program, and his son, Corey Perlman, who facilitates the program at the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary and is also a father of 2 young children. It's time to add tools to your Nurturing Fathers toolbox. Mark and Corey, take it away.
Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Nurturing Fathers podcast. My name is Corey Perlman, and I'm here with my beloved dad, Mr. Mark Perlman. Papo, how you doing, buddy?
I'm doing great. Beautiful day in Sarasota, Florida. Always nice to hang out with my younger son and all of you out there.
Amen. Amen. Well, this is a special one, everybody. This one I've been looking and wanting to do for a long time. And I hope you'll enjoy it, enjoy the ride with me as much as I'm about to, because I'm going to learn some stuff too. But we've been starting this series that mimics a portion of the Nurturing Fathers program called His Story or His Story, and learning about the father that might be in the class or potentially his father and learning about his story. Well, today I want to learn about my dad's story. So I'm going to interview my beloved dad. So are you ready for that, Dad?
I'm ready. Can we heavily edit this thing? No, I'm just kidding.
Can we heavily edit this thing? Man, I mean, I hope you got the tissues ready. And I mean, you know, it's going to be pretty crazy. No, I'm just kidding.
No pressure. Okay.
No pressure. All right. So for those of you that are watching, you know, we're also going to have this on video as well, probably broken up into a couple of different segments. But I hope that for those of you that have been part of the Nurturing Fathers program over the years, that know my dad in any form or fashion, will enjoy some of the background to how he got started and how the program got started and where we're going in the future. And if you guys know me at all, I'm definitely going to have some questions to put my dad on his toes. So here we go. Don't be nervous. All right. So here we are. You ready, Dad?
I'm ready, Corey.
So I'm interviewing the author of the Nurturing Fathers program. So I want to begin, of course, since we are talking about fathers, with the women in your life.
And that's it.
That's it. I'm just trying to scare you. I want you to tell us about your upbringing. So when I talk about the women in your life, I mean about the powerful women that were a part of your upbringing, specifically your mother and your grandmother. So tell us, go back all the way back in time to when you were a little boy and their presence in your life and how that impacted you moving forward.
All right. I grew up in New York City, the Bronx, lived in an apartment building with a park across the street, which was actually a wonderful way for a kid to grow up. We lived with my father, my mother, and my mother's mother, which was not uncommon then. The grandparents would live with the family. So I had 2 strong women figures in my life from that perspective. Nanny, my grandmother, and my mother, Phyllis. Phyllis was a beautiful woman. When she was 17 years old with long red hair, my father spotted her. He had a men's club that gathered once a month. It's funny because I've been doing men's groups forever. Well, he had a men's club. Shows you how the apple doesn't fall too far from the tree. And into this men's club on a women's invitation night walks my mother with her girlfriend. And my father said to the man sitting next to him, his buddy, that's the woman I'm going to marry.
Wow.
And that's where it all started. So my mother was a very shy, kind of protected 17-year-old beauty with red hair. And these 2 got together. And I can say one of the great choices that benefited my life was that my mother accepted my father's invitation. And those 2 got together because they were a wonderful pair. And she chose a really good man for herself, which was a key to her future, I must say. My mother came from a disrupted background. She had no father. He abandoned the family, took all their money. It was very traumatic. My grandmother, Nanny, gave my mother the choice at the tender age of 17 of either staying at home and bringing up her sister, who was 8 years younger, which she was not up for doing, or going out into the world working and earning the family a living, which she was barely up for doing. She went out and she did her best she was a sales girl at like one of the big department stores, and she did okay, but it was very stressful for her. So she was a woman who a lot of her life was under a lot of stress. And the way that manifested itself is she was sometimes short-tempered with my brother and I, would resort to sort of the shortcut of slapping or hitting, not that frequently, but it was too frequently. And that was a tough part of it. But for the most part, she was a loving, very bright, very, very good woman and very good mother. She was as accepting and open to different ethnicities and personalities that anybody I ever met. And my orientation toward being not only accepting, but embracing differences comes directly from her. And she and I got closer and closer and closer as we got older. And toward the very end, and she was her dying period, we just mended any fence or forgave each other for whatever we needed to and ended up in pure love. So my relationship with my mother was very strong, even with the bumps in the road. And in every family, there are bumps in the road. It's a question of how serious and how dangerous. Nanny, her mother, was a little bit of a different story. Nanny was a bright woman, probably beautiful in her own day. She was a huge presence in my household. Never disturb Nanny, never wake her up when she's sleeping. We were literally walking on sort of Nanny eggshells. But, she was kind of dysfunctional in that after her husband left, she never left the house, never went out to the world to work, never really socialized much. And she was difficult. She was, I loved her and she loved me. The love in the household was never questioned, but she saw me as her project. And it was very overprotective. And I must say, I got more, if there's any possibility of too much nurturing, I got too much nurturing from Nanny. It was almost no room to breathe. It's like, don't come in too late, dress warm. And unfortunately, she would sit with me as her 8-year-old, 10-year-old grandson, and she would bemoan her fate in terms of being a person that didn't accomplish what they might have. And I remember feeling and thinking as a boy, God, it's sad. I love this woman. What am I supposed to do with that information? She also was very close to me, and I loved her until the day she died. We had a really good relationship. She ended up moving before my teenage years to my mother's sister's house. So she was at my house for my teenage years. But those were the two very strong women in my life. My mother and father had a powerful love relationship. One of the things I do remember, and I felt even as a young boy and a teenager, it was remarkable that they adored each other. And my father would put his hand on my shoulder and say, "Isn't she the most beautiful woman you've ever seen, your mom?" And it's like, wow, that's a very cool way to think, And I must feel that influenced me to appreciate women and certainly value the woman who I chose to be my wife. My father was adoring to my mother, and they had a really, really nice relationship. Don't know if I ever really saw a fight or an argument. They had their differences, but they somehow made it all work.
Yeah, I remember growing up that you talked a lot about the powerful women that were in your household and how that developed you and was part of that. So I wanted to start with that. As we always say, the woman in the relationship, we talk so much about nurturing fathers, but of course, the women in our lives have been as much, a part of the value and who we've become. So I wanted to start with that.
No question. It's absolutely true. Yeah.
So when we start the Nurturing Fathers program, typically one of the first places we go is we talk about our fathers and the impact that he had on us both positively and negatively. So you started out talking a little bit about your dad, and I want you to kind of specifically tell us, reflect on your relationship with him. Think about the comic strip that we have in the book about things that you wanted to take with you into your parenting style with Jamie and myself, things you wanted to leave behind and things that you wanted to create on your own. But talk a little bit about Barney and your relationship with him and how he impacted you as a father.
Well, Bernard Perlman, always called Barney, long before the comic character, he was a very good father and a very sweet man. He was a gentle man. He was a loving man. He was very basic in terms of his core emotions of caring for his family, loving his family, devotion to his wife. He was very patient about having Nanny around because that wasn't an easy situation with her dominance in the household. But he had a basic purpose for his life. When he was a young boy, he grew up in a working class Manhattan family. He went to a boys' high school, and he came up for a basketball one day to where we ended up living in the Bronx, across from Street That Park. They were walking past this building at the top of the hill across from the park, going to this basketball game. And he looked at his friends who were walking with, and he said, I'm going to live there someday. And that building, at that point, it had a doorman. It was on top of the hill. It was kind of out of his range. But that's a comment that he made. Well, sure enough, he devoted his life pretty much to raising his family and bringing us up from a more poor background to a solidly middle-class background. That was his true devotion. So it meant 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. So in large part, my father was not a constant presence in my life. From Monday through Saturday, I barely saw him. It was pretty amazing if he got home in time for dinner. But Sunday was our day. Sunday was the day he'd let mom sleep in. He'd cook me some breakfast, which was always these soft boiled, what he called coddled eggs that I would open up and they would drip out. I hated them. I couldn't stand it. I mean, I like hard boiled eggs, but these soft ones, it was like, but I ate them because Pop made them for me. After that, get the baseball gloves, go across to the park and throw the ball for whatever length of time. In the meanwhile, we're talking, hanging out. He's teaching me a little bit of skills. But that was the ritual. And I remember those days of just throwing the ball back and forth with incredible youthful pride and sort of a nurturing comfort, like a shroud around me, because it was me and Dad doing our thing. Nobody else was around. My brother wasn't born yet. And it was a very memorable time. He was a kind and gentle man to be around. I was really never afraid of him. In fact, if I would not have used the term back then, but he was truly a nurturing male in a world and environment that I had no other man that I would probably call that, because men were rough and tough. That was much more the rough and tumble model of maleness. His friends, the adult males that came and went, my Uncle Roy, who was married to my mother's sister, were not that kind and gentle, were certainly not soft in the way he was. So I always felt comfortable being by his side. There was one aspect of him that was unfortunate, but it was a reality that I lived with. And that is when I did break the rules, and usually the great transgression was staying out too late. Why you only was the last one home? It's cold outside. You never dressed warm enough. Why you always the last one home? Well, it was the last one home. And that was because being home wasn't the most comfortable place for me. Being out in the streets was much more my thing. So sometimes my mother and Nanny, especially Nanny, would get so enraged and so nervous that my father would walk through the door after 10 hours of work and they would land on him with, you got to go find that boy. You got to bring him home. He's never home on time. So by the time my father found me, he was like out of his mind. So he'd literally grab me by the collar, take me home. He would knock me around, whatever he did. I never got hurt, but, he was out of control. And then Nanny would jump in and say, hey, leave the boy alone, Barney. Stop doing that. So there's no winning for poor Dad, But I do remember that handful, not many, of like him being just enraged by the intensity that the women were sort of like feeling at the moment. But other than that, he was just a kind man. And I must say, I think I learned something about nurturing maleness from my father as a role model.
Another thing that I remember you talking a lot about with him is, although you didn't have a ton of time week in and week out, the rituals were important. And one ritual I remember in particular was root beer floats, right? Didn't you guys do something with root beer floats?
Hot Fudge Sundae.
Hot Fudge Sundae.
From a candy store. Yeah, but one other thing let me mention, because this is a real formative one, that when I got a little older, by 13, 14, or 15, he would have me come work on a Saturday side by side with him at this. He had managed a bunch of restaurant places for some wealthy friend of his. He was the kind of manager. And one of these places was literally like a hot dog stand with pizza, but it was in a Hispanic neighborhood in the Bronx. And a lot of people spoke Spanish. Cops would come in to eat. It's a luncheonette kind of place with a counter. Kids would come for ice cream after school. And he'd ask me to come work for him on Saturday. It was probably my first job. So I worked side by side for him. And holy cow, I saw another side of my father. I mean, he was in charge there. When the guy who was his cook, who was probably 6'2" and about 250 pounds, came in after a drunk all night and wasn't ready for work, my father would open up this bottle of ammonia, take the guy's head in his hand, put it over the bottle, say, take some deep breaths and get ready for work.
Wow.
I'd be standing there and say, what? So I learned a whole different side of him. He knew that the cops were taking care of him, so he took care of them.
Wow.
And I once served the cop a cup of coffee and put my hand out for the money, and a gentle hand put their hand on my hand, pulled it back, and my father said, we never charge them here. So it was like
That's awesome.
Little survival lessons.
When I remember the root beer floats was at his funeral, you and your brother took my brother and I out to the fields, and we had a root beer float in honor of him. Maybe that was his favorite drink or something.
Yeah, that one at Hot Fudge Sundays. He'd send me down. We had candy stores on every corner. So he'd send me down on Sunday night to get him his root beer float hut. And he'd say, go buy Hot Fudge Sundays for yourself and your brother and everyone else in the family.
Oh.
So I came home loaded down with ice cream and goodies, and it was a memorable and a good time.
Kind of transitioning a little bit. So most of what your dad did, obviously you wanted to take with you. Is there one thing in particular that you would say as you start thinking about your relationship with me and with Jamie that you wanted to take with you from your dad that he was able to do?
On a positive side.
On a positive side.
Yeah. Oh, definitely time spent. And there was often with little sports and teaching, but just time spent, whether it was homework, throwing that ball, which we did a lot of. And I wanted basically the time to be nurturing as it was with him and not fearful. You know, sometimes Dad's lessons were so rigid or harsh because he wanted you to be the best that they would become fearful and unpleasant. So I wanted the times with you both to be nurturing, fun, and relaxed with the absence of fear. That's interesting because people don't think, well, time with Dad is great. But time with Dad can and is great, but it's not always great. If Dad is a real taskmaster and, excessive in his requests, it could be real stressful or almost fearful for the child. So I did not want the fear there. I wanted the relaxation and pure fun that I felt.
Thanks for listening to the Nurturing Fathers podcast. Have questions or comments? Join the conversation at facebook.com/nurturingfathers or email us at nurturingfathers@gmail.com.